Hello, welcome to Free Grace Bible Study. We're currently studying through the Gospel of John, and we're going to take a look at a story in John chapter 2. But first, I want to remind us of the purpose statement of the Gospel of John. We look at it every time, but here it is again, chapter 20, verse 31 specifically. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in His name. The most important thing in your eternal existence is you believe in Jesus. And if you believe in Jesus, then you have life in His name. Now, that phrase, in His name, is going to become important at the end of chapter 2, which we're going to look at in the next session. But remember, we have disciples that have just believed in His name at the end of the last story that we looked at in our last session. And that story was where Jesus changed water into wine. Now, remember in that story, He said that His time had not come yet, meaning it wasn't time for Him to go public, so to speak, but He did reveal Himself to His disciples. He revealed His glory to them and showed them who He was, kind of behind the scenes. And that was a special moment. Now we continue the story from that point. Verse 12, after this he went down to Capernaum. Capernaum was kind of hometown area for Him, not too far from Nazareth, and it seems to maybe be where Jesus moved to later in His life. And so we find kind of His ministry home base, so to speak, is Capernaum. So He went down to Capernaum, He, His mother, His brothers, and His disciples, and they did not stay there many days. Now at this point, His brothers, among this group, His brothers don't believe in Him yet, but His disciples do. Chapter 2 told us that, the story in chapter 2 that we looked at last session told us that His disciples, they've believed in Him. His mother seems to believe in Him as far as we know, but His brothers don't. But He's still together with all of them. They go to Capernaum, but notice they don't stay there many days, and that's because some important thing is coming up. And the important thing, verse 13, now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, remember, He had been in Jerusalem not long before this. He went back home. He turned the water into wine. He went to Capernaum for a short time. He's back in Jerusalem. Now, I think that maybe the reason why He made that short trip down to the Galilee area was probably that wedding. And now, He spent a few days home, and now He's back in Judea, specifically in Jerusalem. And so something very monumental happens in Jerusalem. And He found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers doing business. Now, there's a little bit of background here, and the way that I view this, I've heard a lot of different descriptions of this. Some people teach this as if it was completely wrong to sell oxen and doves and sheep. I don't think that's the case. I think that the main problem that we're going to run into here is the way in which they were sold and the place that they were being sold. They were being sold by people who weren't selling them for the good of their brothers and sisters. They were selling them to make a buck. So basically the way that this whole system worked is if a Jewish person from out of town was traveling to Jerusalem to make pilgrimage, they would not want to bring their a pack of animals to sacrifice, so they would, for lack of a better term, convert those animals into money and carry that money to Jerusalem, and then they would convert it back into animals, so to speak, meaning that they would buy an animal in Jerusalem. Now, on the surface of it, all of that is okay. That's not necessarily wrong within itself. The problem with what was happening is that the money changers had the pilgrims kind of in a vice. I think of it like this. Have you ever been to an amusement park and, where they don't have a water fountain, you have to buy bottled water and it's an exorbitant price, $5 for a bottled water and $10 for a hot dog and $20 for a hamburger, whatever. You can think of the temple system in that way, except that when you're in an amusement park, you don't have to buy water and you don't have to buy that food. You can bring yours in, from outside. But here in this system, people that were coming in, they were being taken advantage of, and they didn't really have another option. And so these money changers were using the religious system to take advantage of other people. And here's another layer of this. Now, that could happen outside the temple and it still would be bad, but Jesus would have left it alone if that were the case. But here's where the problem really came in, is that the leadership of the temple allowed this scheme basically to place itself inside of the temple. And presumably the reason for that is that the temple leadership was getting a kickback, or they were getting money from this. It's very possible that the sale of these animals, there was some sort of payment passing back and forth between the leadership. And I think that's most likely why Jesus turned over the tables, as we're going to see in a second, because it was embedded in the temple system. It went deeper than just some people trying to scam some pilgrims. It was buried in the temple system. And so what Jesus shows here is that the entire temple system was corrupted. It was corrupted by bad leadership that was out to take advantage of the people. So that's what we're going to see in his actions. Verse 15, when he had made a whip of cords, it's so matter of fact here. It's just like, so obviously Jesus was going to make a whip. He made a whip of cords. He drove them out. He drove the animals out. By the way, it's easy to think that Jesus is here whipping people. I don't think he's whipping people. I think he used the whip to drive the animals out, and then the people followed, of course, because their livelihood was leaving on 4 hooves out the temple gates or whatever. So he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. So Jesus takes incredible action here, action that probably within itself could have got him arrested, and we don't know exactly why they relented and didn't arrest him at this point, but they definitely could have, because he was messing around with the leadership here. It's a reminder that wherever Jesus went, he was in charge. There were other people that thought they were in charge, and they protested what he did, but really, wherever Jesus went, he was in charge. He called the shots. Verse 16, and he said to those who sold doves, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. And there we find it. What he's basically saying is that you've turned the temple into a for-profit business. It wasn't supposed to be that. It wasn't supposed to be that the temple leadership is getting rich off of the exchange rate and all of that was happening with these money changers. It was supposed to be, for lack of a better term, a non-profit organization, an organization that is for the good of the people. But instead of feeding the sheep with its religious ceremonies, it was fleecing the sheep, and Jesus just wasn't going to stand for it. So he makes his stand, and let's see what happens. Verse 17, then his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house has eaten me up. This is one of the things I love about the Gospels, is that when something happened in the life of Jesus and it occurred to the disciples that it was a fulfillment of prophecy, then they will usually mention it. You see a lot of that in Matthew and Luke especially. I mean, it's in all of the Gospels, but for me it seems like it happens a lot more in Matthew especially. But here, the disciples, they knew this verse from the Old Testament prophets, and they saw it embodied in Jesus. And if you think about this system, many people were probably frustrated with these money changers in the temple. But Jesus was the one that did something about it. He was the one that turned over the tables. And so the disciples recognized in Jesus the fulfillment of this prophecy from the Old Testament prophets. Verse 18. So the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us since you do these things?" Basically what they're saying is, we want you, Jesus, to prove that you have the authority over the temple. So who would have the authority over the temple? Well, the Messiah would. So it seems like what they're saying is, prove that you're the Messiah, because that would prove that he had authority over the temple. And so they ask for a sign. Now, this is going to become a common theme. It's really in all of the Gospels, but it's going to become a common theme in the Gospel of John, where people will see a sign and then they'll ask for a sign. And it's kind of maddening. It's crazy because, in later chapters, Jesus will do a miracle and then people will say, well, but, show us a sign to prove for sure that you're the Messiah. And it seems like that's what's going on here, is they just saw this man take charge of the temple, but what they say is, show us a sign to show that you have authority. And the amazing thing here is, nobody needed to prove authority. They should have known from the scriptures that the house of God should not be a house of merchandise. They should have already known that. The scriptures were enough authority. But now they had the one who had spoken the scriptures into being in front of them, and they contested it. They protested. They fought against him. Notice what Jesus said. Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." So it's a really amazing little tidbit, because what it tells us is, way back at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, because this is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he knew where he was headed. He knew what was coming, and he prophesied it. Now, the people at the time didn't know what he was talking about. Verse 20, then the Jews said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" So clearly, they're missing the deeper meaning here. And even the disciples were missing the deeper meaning. Because think about it, the disciples had not been following him very long. I mean, it was only, a few days before this, maybe a couple of weeks, that they were in Judea. They followed him for the first time. He turned water into wine. But all of that took place in a really short amount of time. So they didn't know Jesus very well yet, and they didn't really have a complete grasp on the entirety of what his ministry would be about. So when he's talking about 3 days and raising up, they didn't see it. In fact, that's what verse 21 tells us. But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So everyone around him missed this meaning. They thought he was saying that if they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, then he would rebuild it in 3 days, which sounds crazy. But when you think about what he was actually saying, it makes total sense based on where his ministry is heading, where he is specifically heading, and that is to the cross. So he was speaking about the temple of his body. Verse 22, therefore, when he had risen from the dead, okay, so now we're seeing sort of like a flash forward. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, which would have been about 3 years later, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scriptures and the word which Jesus had said. Now, what's amazing about this statement is it tells us that the disciples didn't know everything about Jesus. Even by the time Jesus went to the cross, for instance, there were still things they didn't know, because they didn't understand this statement until after the cross, after Jesus had been raised from the dead. And if you remember the end of the Gospels, what we have is the disciples in the upper room, waiting, just not knowing what to do, and struggling to believe that Jesus was going to return from the dead, to raise back up from the dead. And then when Jesus arrived, they still didn't believe it. It was as if they had scales over their eyes. And so it wasn't until after all that they saw with clarity what Jesus was talking about in the temple that day. And so here's a lesson that we can draw from this, that the disciples specifically believed in Jesus very early on, But they didn't believe everything about Jesus because they didn't know everything about Jesus. And in fact, I guess you could say we probably won't know everything about Jesus even for all of eternity. We'll continue to learn more and more about him, I believe that. But the disciples knew a relatively small amount about Jesus, but it was enough for them to have everlasting life. They believed in him as the Messiah, as the giver of everlasting life, and they received that free gift, that irrevocable gift of everlasting life, as soon as they believed it. And then they continued to learn more and more about Jesus. And I think this ought to impact how we evangelize. If you feel like you have to give all of the information before someone is going to believe in Jesus, then that's a misguided approach. There are certain things that probably will come first. And when we talk about Jesus, when we try to convince people to believe in him, some of the things that ought to come first are his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And probably some of his miracles, some of those things that will help people to overcome their disbelief. And then they, just like us, will continue to learn more and more about Christ. So we need to be careful not to think that we have to back up the dump truck and dump every bit of information about Jesus on those we're trying to evangelize. Even the disciples didn't understand some of the basic things about Jesus, but they believed enough to have everlasting life. Well, that's all for this time. In our next session, we're going to look at a very short little section that comes at the end of chapter 2. Look forward to being back with you for that. But I want to remind you before I go that you can find all kinds of great stuff on our website, freegrace.in. You can get subscribed there for our daily devotions, for various podcasts, even stuff that we make for kids. So be sure to go to freegrace.in. Thanks for watching. I'll be back with you soon.